Hey everybody, welcome to another Drive Through FM as well as another top 10 list. So over the last couple of months I've taken a couple of polls in terms of the types of top 10 lists that folks want to hear about, and I think by far the most asked for is the top 10 solo games. So that's what I'm going to cover today. Before I jump into sort of the meat of the list, I'll just give you a couple of kind of explanations and reasonings for what's going on and kind of my thought process really. It's been 3 years since I did the last one. I think it's just a little bit over 3 years. So some things have changed since I did my top 10 solo list, and some stuff has actually hung around. And there's one or two things I should really say sort of about my kind of tendencies as terms of solo gaming. I don't do a ton of solo gaming, but I do enjoy it. That is fun. Sometimes at this stage of my life, I seem to prefer solo board games over video games, even though I play video games a little bit too still. Well, there's one thing that I've sort of grown out of, so to speak, or grown away from, probably is a better way to say it. And that is like competitive games with a solo mode. Not whole hog, but like Caverna, I used to like to play that solo, but I don't really like that anymore. Like a Gaia Project, Vital Lacerda games, that kind of stuff. Just because I like the competitive side of it that much more with more players at the table, I just really miss it when I'm playing it solo. So I know there's a lot of folks that, they play solo probably more than they play with other people. So those modes probably are okay for like a lot of people that enjoy solo gaming, but just having had that kind of taste, of the competitive side with the other folks sitting at the table, those kind of tamp it down a little bit for me. So you're not gonna see a lot of that here. Maybe one thing here or two things kind of that will sort of fit into that sort of category. And one thing that I very much learned that I really just seem never to like is solo games, they're kind of board games. They're kind of like choose your own adventure games. So over the last couple of years, I've sort of dabbled in some of the newer game books, like the old Choose Your Own Adventure books, the Steve Jackson Sorcery style books, Fighting Fantasy style books. I enjoyed those when I was a kid. I'd probably in my preteen years is about when I played that. Maybe preteen, like 8, 9, 10, 11, something like that. I loved those games when I was a kid. But now, like Destiny Quest is a book series that I would say is probably the best one of these. But I still really didn't like that one. After by the time I got to the end of the first book, I was like, I don't like this at all. Legacy of Dragonholt, it would probably be the other one that I would recommend. That one, I don't know, I loved 75% of that one, but there was just something about the way it sort of unfolded. I would like to see that system revisited. I think I could, if there was one that I could really get into, it would be that sort of design. I liked all the mechanics and everything like that. But there's been some other choose your own adventure style games. Most notably recently is a game called Tainted Grail, which I really, really wanted to like, and I just do not like at all. And I always feel that the choose your own adventure games, because they have the whole let's reset to the previous level or reset the adventure, that really ends up bothering me. I don't think that's very fun. Whereas if you played something like Pandemic Legacy, which you could play solo, and I have, again, I kind of prefer that playing with somebody else, but that one, you can lose a scenario or a mission in Pandemic Legacy, but you keep going, right? It just affects the overall thing. And then at the end, only do you find out if you kind of won or lost or how bad or how great you did, where this whole trope of you get to a certain point and then bam, you have to reset. Oh, your guy died, bam, you have to reset. Because a lot of times in these choose your own adventure games, and Tainted Grail is no exception, there's just random dumb stuff that can happen to you, and it's that was bad luck, but now I have to reset? I want to play a different game. And I have some other issues with Tainted Grail in general. I mean, beyond just the choose your own adventure type. But I also think, to be honest, I'm a little bit biased against it, because by the time I played through the second scenario of it, I was like, oh, I think I hate these kind of games overall, because I'm really not enjoying this at all. So you're not going to see any of that kind of stuff. But I think there is going to be some things on this list that for me, it's just a much more rewarding game experience than trying to shove some kind of narrative that isn't going to meet the quality of reading a good book, for example. That doesn't have, I don't have to choose, just give me the good book and write it well, and that's going to be more rewarding for me than me flipping pages and then resetting and all that stuff. Or I'd rather play like a D&D or something too, because that's a whole other, category there. So that, other than that, say I have one honorable mention. So I'll start the list now, timestamp it here. My one honorable mention here is Horrified. This one just kind of barely misses the cut. This would be like my number 11, I think, for sure. I like to have in my collection a quick and easy and accessible solo game that I can just set up, very easy to set up, very easy to play. This kind of replaced Forbidden Island, Forbidden Desert for me. That was kind of like, I would just have that. And, if I'm just like bored and I don't want to pull out a new game, I don't want to read rules for something for game night, I don't want to watch TV. If I'm just like, oh, I'm really bored, I would always get out Forbidden Island. This one is kind of replaced that for me. It's just super easy. You can play like 3-4 times in maybe like an hour and a half. If once you play it a lot, you're just going to kind of grind through it. And so Horrified's really kind of become that just easy to break out, quick solo / co-op game, knock it out again and again. This is a really good game. So that's kind of my honorable mention. Now, getting into the top 10 proper, the number 10 here is one of those that I was talking about that is kind of a competitive game. This is Cloudspire, but it has a fantastic solo and frankly co-op mode. So the reasons I like this solo is because this is just a fantastic puzzle that it presents you, and it really does it, I think, in a very unique and different way. So you play through this campaign of sorts. There's 4 factions that come in the main box. There's a 5th faction that you can get. So if you're going to kind of play through the solo game in a campaign, you're going to take one of the factions, then you're going to play kind of 3 games with that faction against some of the other factions, and then you'll stop playing the faction you were playing, and then you'll choose, well, you won't choose, but the story will kind of show you the next faction. So you're playing through the narrative. You're not really driving it or anything by any kind of branching choices, although there is a little bit of how well you do in one scenario will sort of change up the beginning of the next scenario, which is fine. That's plenty, because you're really just kind of along for the ride in terms of the narrative, but the gameplay is really where it's focusing on and setting up a puzzle that initially, for like on the first blush, is always like, this is cheating. Like, how am I supposed to beat this? And it does things that in a normal like head-to-head game would just not be possible. It just flat out like breaks the rules. But then you have to kind of piece and tease together how I'm going to solve that puzzle. And because it has this kind of programmatic aspect, it's like a MOBA style game that, just kind of, in some respects, you'll set it up and it'll kind of run on its own. That programmatic MOBA stuff really marries nicely with the whole puzzle aspect. So this is one of my top games from last year, from 2019, from Chip Theory Games, and this is definitely my favorite Chip Theory game, and definitely one of the neatest approaches to a solo game that I've seen. And I think more games could do this, where you, instead of competitive games where you have like a target victory point number or something like that, or you're just trying to beat your best score, if they can present to you like different sort of strategic choices and things that you can kind of learn about the game and how the game kind of works to kind of guide you through. So I think a lot of the stuff that I've sort of played with, it sort of like is like, oh, this, I got to remember this little trick, because when I go play head to head, this will kind of come in handy. So it's kind of a neat, almost like very glorified tutorial, but in a way some video games have the thing of, you kind of play through the solo mode. So if you think of like StarCraft or something, you play as the Terran, for like a bunch of scenarios, and then you switch to the Zerg, and then you switch to the Protoss. This has the same kind of thing, and then you can go play head to head, which is a totally different game mode. But you learn things playing through that campaign that are going to come in handy, when you play against another player. So that's number 10, Cloudspire. Very interesting, innovative, and just a really cool design there. So number 9 is actually a miniatures game, and this is Warlords of Erewhon, or I like to call it Warlords of Nowhere, because it's nowhere backwards. This is a newish game from Warlord Games, from Rick Priestley, who was the designer of the original Warhammer miniatures games. And the reason that this is soloable is because of its bolt action system that it uses. So bolt action is a system that they've used in a lot of different miniatures games. And what you do is you put different colored dice in a bag, and then you draw the dice out, and then whichever team's dice you draw, they're going to take that die, and it has some different like orders and things like commands, and they can charge, and they can kind of hunker down, and they can do like a wait action. So you're going to choose one of the units on your side, assign that order, and then execute the order, and then you're going to draw out of the bag, and then whoever's team gets the dice drawn, they're going to go. So theoretically, player A could go like 3 times in a row, and then player B could go, and then it would go back to player A, or they could just alternate. So it's going to be kind of random, the order that the different units activate, but it makes it very soloable, because when you draw the die out of the bag, you go, okay, so I'm playing as this player now. Who would I want to activate and do the best possible move that I can think of that team would want to do? So I'm gonna charge my mammoth into your skeletons, or I'm gonna activate my necromancer and cast a spell on this unit of skeletons or something like that. So, and then you put the die down, and then you forget all about it, and you draw a new die, and you go, oh no, it's my turn again, or it's the other player's turn, so now I gotta switch gears there. So it makes it really easy to solo, because there's not really any like hidden information. There's not any sort of grand, large-scale movement strategy in terms of you having to execute all your movement at once, like typically in Warhammer, Age of Sigmar, or 40k. It's very tactical, back and forth, alternating activation kind of thing. And it just, each die pull is like a little mini puzzle that you're like, ooh, what should I do here? Okay, this would be good. And then this and that. So there's not any like trickery that you have to like enable, which is sometimes a big part of some of these movement first, I'll call it movement first miniature games, that this doesn't really have that. So this is a very, very cool, interesting way to play miniature games. And honestly, it's on the list because of that, because I don't think there's really many miniature games that you can play solo. I mean, you can, like I've done them to like learn the rules and things like that, but it's not as, this is, again, it's the same kind of idea with like Agricola. It's like not anywhere near as fun as playing against another player or partner and, sort of trying to outfox each other. You just lose all of that. Where this is, it kind of obfuscates a little bit of that, so you can still kind of engage fully with the game. So that is Warlords of Erewhon, and if you got a bunch of miniatures laying around, I definitely would recommend taking a look at this because it doesn't really require a whole boatload of miniatures, although you could scale it up to sort of a grand battle, but this would apply just fine to like more of a skirmishy type of game. It's kind of in between like a skirmish game, like a Warcry or Necromunda or Frostgrave, and then like a large scale battle. So if you've played any of the Warhammer games, think of it about a ballpark about 1,000 points worth of units, but of course that's going to give or take based on the type of army you build. But it's kind of that in between skirmish and large scale battle. So that was number 9, Warlords of Erewhon, and number 8, keeping with the same theme here, is Nuclear Winter 68. Now this is the box to the first and only expansion, Heart of Darkness. This is a very, very cool game, and it's very similar for the reasons that I chose Warlords of Erewhon. This has a chit pull system where you will pull activation chits out of a bag and then again execute one of the units on a side. And it even has a 3-player narrative campaign. That's just in the base game. It's got a bunch of extra goodies like that in the expansion. And so it gives you, I think it's a 9 scenario campaign to play through. And you kind of will shift focus, not only as you pull chits, but as you sort of play the different scenarios, you kind of shift focus between, what this is kind of an alternate, like World War II history game where like a nuclear bomb has been dropped on Germany, and there's like zombies and like weird mutants, not zombies like Walking Dead, but like more like mutants that's like one faction. Then there's like the remnants of the Third Reich, and then there's like the Allied forces, US and Britain and so on. And so all these factions are kind of like vying for territory control, and it plays very much like a traditional like hex and counter war game. It's got all those abilities with the little chits and the stats and the way you roll the dice and the combat and stuff like that, and the activation. You got like leaders to activate, which will activate like a zone of control around them, that kind of stuff. So it's got all that cool war game stuff that I like to play sometimes, but it's this completely ridiculous fantasy setting. And it has this, in this case, called the lock and load system. And so if I would recommend like this kind of, if this theme, and you're like, that theme sounds dumb, but take a look at the lock and load system in general to find maybe a theme. They've got all kinds of themes, and they're all war themes, but a lot of them are World War II. Some of them are a little bit more modern warfare. I've seen a lot of them that are very skirmishy, squad level, like modern street level fighting stuff that looks kind of interesting. Yeah, so if you're into that kind of tactical combat and strategy stuff, then definitely I would recommend any of these lock and load systems as a good, cool entry to a solo game. I particularly like this one because it kind of feels like I'm playing sort of like a Fallout derivative, Fallout the video game, I should say. But it's kind of like, it's the same time frame as Fallout ballpark, but it's in Europe and it's post-World War II, and, I think it takes place in the 1960s in this universe. So it's got a lot of kind of neat stuff, and the whole narrative campaign aspect of it is kind of what really ends up kind of drawing me in and really enjoying this. So this is Nuclear Winter 68. Oh, it does place in 1968. It takes place in 1968, of course. Anyway, brain fart. So that is number 8, Nuclear Winter 68. Number 7, I don't have the box anymore, but I have this case here. This is Marvel Champions. This is also one of the top games from last year. This one I think will be very high, like on my top 100, my top 50 games of all time, if and when I ever did that list again. But so this is amazing solo. Now I do really like Marvel Champions with other players. I don't really know. I think I like it probably more with other players than I do solo. But that just shows you how much I really like the game, because I really love it solo, and I love it even more with players. But this has got to be one of my best favorite solo games. Just, I don't know, there's so much about it that I really, really like. And I think kind of the takeaway for me in terms of like the solo ability of this, which is why it's on this list, is actually there's no campaign, which is fantastic. That to me is like probably the most unsung cool part of the game, is I don't have to like play through a narrative, and there's no narrative to play through. So if I play through the non-existent narrative, then I feel like I already did that, so why would I do it again? This one is just like, let me take this hero, let me throw it against Ultron or the Green Goblin or whatever Wrecking Crew is coming out. And you can take this hero and throw it against that, or this hero against that, this hero against that. And because that to me feels very, very much like a comic book. A comic book universe is just a mess, right? Like if you take Doctor Doom, all of the Marvel superheroes have fought Doctor Doom. Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, X-Men, Avengers, Incredible Hulk, who's kind of part of the Avengers, Alpha Flight, whatever. I'm just coming. Excalibur, X-Factor, New Mutants. They've all fought Doctor Doom. Submariner, you just keep going. You list every single Marvel hero. They probably have fought Doctor Doom. I'm sure Black Panther fought Doctor Doom at some point, or She-Hulk, And so that feels like what a comic book game should be. Like I shouldn't always have to do like these big long campaigns and be like, oh, where was I? Oh, I got to manage the bookkeeping in between the games. But this still has that, because if you take She-Hulk and you fight the Green Goblin and you get your butt kicked, then you can say, okay, let me go back and, lick my wounds back at my Bat Cave, or my She-Hulk cave, right? And then, kind of calibrate and reconfigure to go and try to do battle again and stop their scheme from going off. Because that's what always seems to happen in the comic book and in the movies, is the heroes, they go try to stop the villain, they get trounced halfway through the movie or halfway through the series or whatever, and then they go back and they have to like come up with this crazy wacky plan to pull it off at the last minute. And that's kind of what this just does. Like you just are constantly revisiting it without like trying to like handcuff me to this narrative, which is probably crappy, right? Let's be honest. These are game designers, not necessarily good writers. So I don't want to beat anybody up, because I have had some good stories. But most of the good stories that I have when I play a game emerges out of like the chaos vortex of all the players at the table and all the little components and these cool little interesting random things that happen that just kind of grow out of the experience naturally. And I think that's what this does. And so I definitely recommend Marvel Champions. And I've had a chance to play now the Green Goblin stuff with the two new heroes, Ms. Marvel and Captain America at this point. Those are the ones that are out. And really have enjoyed those. Although Captain America kind of makes it easy mode. But that's kind of the fun thing. So I haven't taken Captain America yet against Ultron, which I've not beat. So I need to do that. Now that I'm saying it out loud, I want to break it open and play Captain America against Ultron, because I haven't beat Ultron yet. And Captain America just seems to whoop everybody else. So, but I definitely recommend Marvel Champions. So that brings me to number 6. Number 6 is Shadows of Brimstone, and this is just one of the many expansion boxes that I have for it. I think I talked about this on some other video a while ago, and I showed a different box. So this is the Forbidden Fortress one. Now this is a game that is set in like multiple universes, really. It's if you ever played like HeroScape, it kind of has that vibe, but not specifically, because it's like you have these portals through these different mine shafts that just seem to like leak out into other dimensions. So in the original, you played like Old West characters fighting against like weird aliens and Cthulhu-esque demons and all kinds of other crazy demons and stuff like that, and other bandits and like mutated bandits. And then in this newer series, you have like different samurai fighting against more Asian themed demons, but there's no reason you can't mix everything all together and have Cthulhu and Asian themed demons and cowboys and samurais and everything all mixed together. And there's like Viking stuff coming out from the latest Kickstarter, and like conquistadors, Spanish conquistadors. So there's all these different like time periods and stuff like that. I'm sure they're going to throw some futuristic stuff in there. There's just all kinds of just a variety of monsters and things like that. And so what this really is to me, now just put a pin in what I'm about to say, because when we get towards the end of the list, you're going to be like, huh? This one to me is like the spiritual successor to the old Warhammer Quest game from Games Workshop back in like the 90s, right? This is the one where you have, it's a dungeon crawl, really, but it's really a light RPG. When we played it with my group, we played it several times now through like a campaign, and it's very combat hack and slash driven, but there's like enough RPG elements in here that I feel like more I'm playing an RPG than a dungeon crawl, because you've got all this between adventure stuff. You have all of this, you know, like you can go to town and you can go on little adventures in between your main skirmish combat things. You know, your character is going to grow and die and get mutations and level up and all this kind of stuff. So basically you play till like about level 8, and then the game kind of plateaus from there. So it's not really that official, but the idea is that you kind of get to level 8 and then you stop and make a new character, because you've sort of ascended, and that character can retire once they get to level 8. Because you do get pretty powerful at level 8, so there's not really a point in like you just going to crush a lot of stuff. But yeah, so there's just, in the game again, it's a campaign, but this is more procedurally generated, which kind of harkens back to that old Warhammer Quest, that you're not on rails, you're not doing a linear thing. You don't have to go from this one to this one to this one. You can smash it together. There's been some kind of fan modifications that kind of make it a little bit more strict. But I found that I'm not really into that. Like, I'm into like, what are we doing today, guys? Well, let's go here and we'll go down this tunnel and then we'll go into this other dimension, whatever. We're just trying to go and get this Darkstone, which is become this currency through all these different dimensional portals, and you get them like upgrade your bullets with like Darkstone magic bullets, and you know the Darkstone's going to mutate you if you carry too much of it, and so you're just a bunch of ne'er-do-wells just going in and trying to get rich and and sort of exploit this new thing that's just like appeared on Earth. So because you're not really that married to like a strict overall like narrative arc from character growth to like defeat the Emperor, Darth Vader, that kind of thing at the end, it's just you're a bunch of smugglers and bandits and things like that, and that makes it a lot more interesting and fun to kind of play in. And again, the story kind of emerges through all the random stuff that happens to all the players, so that I really enjoy about Shadows of Brimstone. So that brings us to number 5 here, and this is Defenders of the Realm from Eagle Gryphon Games and Richard Launius, who also designed the original Arkham Horror. This is definitely my favorite Richard Launius game. This one, it's sort of like a fantasy Pandemic. He pilfered a couple of mechanics out of Pandemic and then kind of made him his own, changed them a little bit. He even gives credit in the rule book and stuff like that. And it's sort of fantasy, and you have different heroes, and they're moving around trying to fight defeat these different monsters that are sort of encroaching, and they're sort of tainting the land, and setting fires, and trying to overwhelm different cities and stuff like that. You're going on side quests. In some ways, you're trying to like upgrade, level up your characters by completing the quests and stuff like that. And it's very, very focused on like teamwork. So I do actually prefer this with more than solo. I like it with 2, 3, and 4 players, but I still really, really enjoy it as a solo game. Obviously, it's number 5 on my solo list. At this point, there's a lot of different expansions. There's like 30 different characters you can take. They vary in sort of power. There's different monsters in sort of, I call them monster kingdoms. Like there's an expansion that's just all the different dragons, and there's also like you can get like upgraded ones and play around with the difficulty. So if you do grab some of those, frankly, more overpowered characters, then you can kind of throw them against some of the more difficult monster setups. And there's like upgrade expansions for all different monsters. I like to play this one. I know you can play it like a single character, but I like to play it, with multiple characters at once. I've even sat down and played with 4 at once. And you kind of like piece out that teamwork of that. So it's kind of like you have your own little adventure party kind of going off, and they're doing their own thing. And so each of them, to me, kind of represents a party with a leader that you're controlling. And the level of adventure is really fun in this. Like, again, there's not a very good strict narrative, campaign story. All that's going to emerge, but just kind of the way that the design works and the way everything kind of goes together, it's similar to Marvel Champions. I feel like this is like a world that you can kind of like revisit. So like, okay, we played today, and I played the Ranger and the Paladin and this Wizard, and we beat back these 2 or sorry, 4. It's always 4 kingdoms. These 4 like evil kingdoms trying to take over the land. Good, we beat them, yay, and we succeeded. And then next time, in 10 years' time, there's some new heroes that have shown up. There's some new kingdoms that have come back, and kind of the same cycle over and over again. But you kind of can revisit this world and kind of check in with it at times. And this has that feel, and all that adventure and stuff just kind of comes off of the board. And it's very easy and streamlined to play. It plays like you're kind of, at this point, kind of like your typical co-op. I would say I would say this is the most co-op feeling game. So when I say like it's like you can tell the lineage of Pandemic, that's not just because of the card mechanic, which isn't exactly like Pandemic, but it's close, but it has that co-op vibe to it. Horrified is very much a co-op game, where some of this other stuff I'm talking about is more of a dungeon crawl. It's kind of more of a war game, that kind of thing. It goes into some other areas, but if you think like a strict pure co-op, that's almost like a Euro co-op, right? Which is kind of what Pandemic sort of spawned, that sort of puzzly, simple, elegant Euro co-op. This is right in that. This is a perfectly sweet spot. Now there's some dice rolling and stuff like that, so if you're more of like a puzzle solver and you don't want the dice, then it's not that bad. I would still try the game, but this is fits right in that slot. It's not light, it's not super heavy, but there's just kind of enough going on, and there's like enough gameplay that it feels like a very old school game, especially this day and age, but it's still, the design to me holds up and is really, really fun. Anyway, so that's Defenders of the Realm. That's number 5. And then number 4 here is another one I would put in the same ballpark, but let's talk about it. This is Eldritch Horror. Again, this is one of the expansion boxes. Just instead of holding up all the boxes, this is one of them. This is my favorite cover, the Mountains of Madness one. Now this is obviously, speaking of Lanius, this is sort of like, the sequel to Arkham Horror. They came out with Eldritch Horror a few years ago. I think they've completed making expansions for them. So if you want to get this, it might be tricky. I think you can get it, but everything's out there. So if you're going to get into it, what's out there. You definitely don't need to get all the expansions for sure. I would say though, get the base game obviously, and then at least one expansion, even like the first card expansion, which was a very small expansion, just had some cards, and I think it added focus tokens in the first expansion. I'm not sure if it was the first, second, but yeah, the base game by itself is like not quite enough to me to last. I think it'll be good for like 2, 3 plays maybe, but then you're going to want to add more stuff. But I think once you get 1, 2, 3 expansions, you don't really need like that. You don't need them all. I mean, I have them all, but but you're not really ever going to play with them all. There's some setup cards and stuff like that to sort of randomly set up which expansions you might be using. So that's kind of a neat thing too, because when you revisit it, again, it'll be like a different world. And so this one, it's very akin to Defenders of the Realm. Although this one, I think I actually like playing solo more than with other players. Just, I don't know what it is, because it's just like, to me, I just like seeing what happens. You know, like you just like, you send the characters around and I'm like, oh, that dude went insane, that's funny, you know. Like, you know, like you just like seeing like the nutty stuff. One thing that sticks out in my head is like this like old businessman. The characters are so weird in this game. They're just like there's one character I love playing her. She's an actress, and she just seems to like somehow every time I play it, even with other players or with myself, she always is like good at everything. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of what an actor would do. Like they kind of know a little bit about everything, but they're not really an expert because they're obviously an actor. But it's their job to sort of investigate and like learn about these different like ways of life, I guess. But she always seems to do really good. Yeah, so that's just funny. That's just like a funny thing that happens in the stories of the games that I've played. But there's this one guy, he's like this big old balding, you know, businessman, and he has this dream, and he goes in the dream, and his father comes back, and his father like shoots him in the dream, but it like kills him in real life. And it's just like, what happened? And then there's just all these like weird, crazy things that can happen. And I find that when I play with other players, we tend to try to like optimize and solve, which is, I still do that when I'm solo, but I really like with Eldritch Horror to like just get in there and just kind of like sit with it, you know, for a little bit longer. When you're soloing, you're not really rushed or in a hurry. You know, you can leave it set up. You can leave the game set up and go do something for 10 or 15 minutes and come back to it and be like, okay, where was I? But then you can kind of just sit with it and just be like, that is just crazy what happened, you know? And this one has a big sprawling, you know, world-spanning adventure. There's all these different locations you can go into, and I kind of like that attitude. It has that very Indiana Jones feel. So like when in the Indiana Jones movies, when they show the little line of the airplane flying from like Cairo to some weird island in the ocean to Nepal or whatever, you know, so that has that feel. Like this character goes on this little adventure and they have their little story and they fight these demons, or maybe they go to this weird ancient crypt or whatever. So this just is like spitting out like just Indiana Jones movies like every 10 minutes. So I mean, if that's a reason to like a game, that's why I like this game more than anything, except it has also the extraordinary supernatural stuff. Anyway, so that's Eldritch Horror. This is a straight co-op, but it's definitely way on the Ameritrashy side of the co-op versus Defenders of the Realm, which is more on the Euro side of the co-op. So yeah, but those two are probably about equal, frankly. So that was number 4. Number 3 is going to be a very different style game. This is a coin game, and this is Cuba Libre. And you could definitely consider this one kind of standing in for the series as a whole. Now, I've kind of lost track of the series. I think I played the first 5 or 6 of the series. And then after a while, it's kind of like you're playing the same. It's kind of the same, right? But I would like to play Gandhi. That's the new one that I'm like, oh, that's a cool theme. I really want to try that. So I might try to play that one at some point. But this one is definitely my favorite one. One of the reasons it is because it is my favorite to play solo. And this one you can just kind of do a little bit more with in terms of the way that you play it. Now, I do really enjoy playing it, you know, head to head. I've played a lot of games on Vassal as well as face to face. It makes for a great kind of turn-based or email-based game where you take your turn, you know, you drop your file into a Dropbox or whatever, and then you email, take your turn, and then you go. It works very snappy that way. But solo, this works very, very well. The solo system in these coin games, you know, they're set in a lot of different settings, but they have this sort of branching, like flowchart AI thing, which is cumbersome, but to me, it just somehow works really well with this game. There's been other styles of games that I've played that I do not like the card-driven flowchart stuff. Like the one I can think of is the PAX Premier one. It's just, to me, because it does so much that is like unfair and it breaks too much of the rules, which a lot of them kind of do. which is, getting back to my earlier statement about not liking the competitive games that are made into solo games. Like Cloudspire, which I mentioned earlier, has these impossible to solve puzzles, but they're static. And you sit there and you play it and you solve it, and that's fine. There's enough scenarios in there that you can kind of play through that. And it's not like I haven't gotten through all, there's like 20 scenarios. I haven't gotten anywhere near through all those. But this one also is a little bit more static. Like when you flip a card, it activates normally as a player would activate, but it does it on a very kind of tight script. So the randomness is kind of the order of activations in the way that you have to sort of build up your defenses and kind of hedge your bets about that. It doesn't like go and do something like insanely overpowered that you're like, huh? What? Why do you get to take 8 actions now? It doesn't do that kind of stuff. And so just the way this system is sort of integrated with that sort of flipping of a card and activating, and then you walk down this logical tree, which is very easy to digest, and you kind of really get the hang of it. The little sort of, just a little tangent here, the little sort of side benefit of that is that you can kind of learn by playing it, like, oh, so if I were to play this faction in kind of a real face-to-face game, this is something I might consider as sort of a good kind of opening move. It's just, a nice little suggestion, because one of the things that's tricky about these games is they're actually not super complex in terms of like, here's the 4 or 5 things that you can do on your turn. Why and when I want to do those things ends up being kind of the tricky thing. It's like, okay, so I could build a base, I could, muster some troops, I could do this, I could do the event on the card that get flipped up. It's like, well, what do? I don't know what to do. This is my victory condition. Maybe I should do this, maybe I should do that. Oh, but I didn't know about this other faction. I could also do this, so I should probably do that to prevent that from happening. So all that kind of stuff. So simple kind of game mechanically, but it's like, I don't know what to do, because you just don't know what the good reason is. So playing through kind of the AIs of that helps you kind of learn the different factions in a way. And just, kind of personally, I really enjoy the themes, especially of these earlier versions of the coin system, because they're often set in more modern times. I would say like post 1900, 1850. There are some that have been set, in more like medieval, dark ages, Renaissance. I think there's probably an ancient one. I haven't kept up with all of them. But I like that these address the modern issues to do with warfare, because this is really about the Cuban Civil War in a way that happened in the 50s. And, like you could play a game that was like a hex and counter game or something, or some large theater operational game like a no retreat game or whatever about that. But that's like, is this really just about the battles? I mean, that's an aspect of life and an aspect of the life of war. But I find this sort of the diplomacy and kind of the Twilight Struggle types of things that's going on, manipulating influence and kind of a little bit of an economy kind of thing going. I find that to be a little bit more interesting for me in terms of the more modern conflicts of, why they happened and all that kind of stuff. So this kind of thing is really interesting to me. And this one has an angle, I've talked a lot about this one before, but it has that angle of government, a certain corrupt government with certain corrupt insurgents. And then there's also the mafia involved. So there's corrupt business interests involved and things like that. So, so it's a bunch of corrupt people trying to take over an island, I don't know what to say, but that's interesting. That's super interesting to me. And a lot of these sort of things, like the first one, Andean Abyss, similar idea. Government that's like, a little shady. And then you have some drug dealers trying to take it over, some communists, some very, let's say, fanatical far right-wing guys, and that kind of stuff. So that sort of, those elements that are in play make it interesting. Like it's a very modern concern. A lot of these things I can sort of identify. You can, you see them on the news. You see this kind of thing in the real world. You get these different factions that are like wackos and, can't find a job or something, I guess. So they have to become terrorists or, whatever kind of thing it is, or they have to stoke fear to get people to vote the way that they want them to vote, whatever. So those kinds of things, those tensions and those sort of, the way people kind of play around with those tensions is, it's disgusting, but it's also like, you got to watch out for it. Like, so, and this is kind of the thing that kind of gets you into that. So it gets me into that kind of mentality and kind of puts my brain in a certain space in a situation like this, which is, pretty far removed because it's in the 50s and this has already happened and that kind of thing. So it's an interesting sort of ballpark to play in for somebody like me that just goes to work every day. So that is Cuba Libre. That is number 3. Really cool. I definitely recommend looking at all the coin games, finding a theme that maybe appeals to you a little bit more maybe than this one might. But I definitely recommend this one because it's got a lot of good. It plays really well 2-player, 3-player, 4-player, and also solo. Okay, so that is number 3. Number 2 is Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. And so remember I mentioned to put a pin in the Shadows of Brimstone stuff because I think Shadows of Brimstone does old school Warhammer Quest better than these new Warhammer Quest games do. But I really, really like what these new Warhammer Quest games do. Specifically, Blackstone Fortress. Now that Blackstone Fortress is a Warhammer 40k universe thing. There's been 2 games kind of using a similar system as this, set in the more fantasy Age of Sigmar universe, Silver Tower and Shadows over Hammerhall, which you can actually kind of combine in some ways. This one does it better. So if you pin me down, I'm not even like a 40k guy. Like I like the Age of Sigmar universe and the fantasy universe more than 40k. But specifically this game, the way that you play through this game is mechanically very similar-ish to like a Claustrophobia 1643, and again to the old fantasy Warhammer Quest, Silver Tower and stuff like that, where you have this kind of dice activation type of thing that's going on, and then you have like a little destiny pool of dice that's sort of a universal pool that players can use, and you go through and you play through the campaign here. And this one I've really kind of grown out, and you actually be seeing a video about this. This is sort of coincidence, but there's actually terrain for this. So I got some 3D printed terrain that I'm going to paint out. I did a video about the original set of that terrain last year. Anyway, so this one is such like a living, breathing world kind of thing. So you can see when it comes to the solo games, I'll really lean on anything that comes alive for me. Anything that sort of breathes life into the game, something that I can kind of, again, just kind of sit with. And this is such a cool, mostly procedurally generated type of thing. So there is a loose kind of campaign and arc going through this game where you have to sort of unlock these different strongholds to get to this vault. Although with the expansions, there's a bunch of other kind of side quest kind of things and other little like mini campaigns that you can play through. But the way that you play through it is so easy to get into. And like, it just does so many different things. So if you go watch my review that I did just over a year ago, I'm gonna get way into more detail in the review, but the campaign system is really cool. The way you like save your characters between games is cool. The way you can like pause an adventure is really neat. The combat is really quick and snappy. The AI, actually, when I first played it, I was like, this is kind of bullpucky as far as AI goes. But then after I played it, I was like, holy crap, this actually works really well. And it's so like old school and dead simple. So weird. You just like roll on a table and it's like, that's not a design, but it like really, really works. Like sometimes you don't have to be clever in your design. It just, if it works, it works. And then the way that characters can die and you can add new characters in, and the way it kind of wraps in some of that old school stuff where instead of going back to town and visiting, town and buying items or whatever and resting up, you have your different spaceships and you have this like area called the Precipice, which is sort of like this thing that grew on the side of this Blackstone Fortress where lots of different races in the 40k universe can mix, and you have like little, one-off, little roll-off side adventures there. And it's just a really, really cool thing. And the play of it, I think for me, is probably the most interesting in terms of kind of blending the dungeon crawl stuff that you might see in Shadows of Brimstone, or like an Imperial Assault or Descent, that kind of typical dungeon crawl stuff. But this to me is more fun tactically. It feels more skirmishy, miniature based than those games actually end up being. Like to me, these really have they really kind of leans a little bit to that miniature skirmish side of it and does it in a better way, that I find the combat and stuff like that more interesting. And the way that it sort of also, on the other hand of the other side of that, is that a way that it generates these like random puzzles that are just like really weird, like little side quests that'll take you like 2 minutes to do, and you like interact with them in between these like skirmishy scenarios. It's just a really neat thing. And so it's such a different, fantastic thing that is like kind of liberally stolen from a lot of the, more modern ideas. So like if you compared this to the original Warhammer Quest from the 90s, I think it came out in the 90s, and compared to 2, you can see like, well, why is this so different than Warhammer Quest? So if you like that original Warhammer Quest, you may not like this one because it doesn't really do all of that extra crunchy RPG stuff on top of it, which kind of Shadows of Brimstone does. But this is new. This is a new game. It's modern. We're going to take all these different like components and mechanical design ideas from these other games and throw them in here. And so it feels like a legacy game, feels like a co-op, feels like dungeon crawl, feels like a skirmish game. It just has a lot of cool stuff going on, and just a very different, interesting world. So that's Warhammer Quest: Blackstone Fortress. I'll go into more detail on that in the review. I don't want to kind of keep reiterating why I like games sometimes, but definitely if you want more detail in the game, go take a look at that. That's my number 2. And finally, my number 1 is Rangers of Shadowdeep. Again, this is a miniature game, but this is a 100% solo, maybe co-op miniature game. I would say co-op will work. I've not ever played a co-op. This to me is like if you were looking for a miniature heavy, let's be frank, a miniature heavy solo D&D game. This is it. This is 1,000,000% it. This is one of my top games of all time. This is in my top 5 easily all time. This is just the main book. The main book comes with, I don't remember the scenario count, but it comes with like 2 campaign segments, and then you can get other little miniature books. You get these books only from DriveThruRPG and stuff like that, and you take your character with your ranger with their little like war band, and you will go through, in this case actually, contradicting myself completely, a strict narrative story arc within the confines of a campaign. You don't necessarily have to play all the campaigns in a certain order. You can kind of jump around, and there's like different levels that certain adventures are made for. So like as you level your characters up, then you may or may not play this campaign. Although there are some characters that will, and this is getting to my next point, that will vary based on the level you are. So you don't have to be like level 15 to play this or level 5 to play this. There'll be little rules or small balancing adjustments, depending on which level you're in. And I would 100% play through. I played through the main campaign in the whole book here. I played through this book, and I would play through it again. And I would play through. I played through one of the expansion books and a little bit of the other one. One of the expansion ones, I was like, the only disappointing thing was that there was a werewolf one. I didn't like that one. That's the only thing I haven't liked about it. Everything else that I've played, I've absolutely adored, absolutely loved. You take your adventure, you set up a bunch of terrain. Like, it's very terrain heavy and terrain specific. But if you're not into that, like if you are a D&D player, don't let that scare you away, because why can't you just take a grid like you use in D&D or Pathfinder or whatever, and then do your little terrain stuff on there and do your miniatures on there and play through it that way. There's no reason you cannot do that. Like 100% you can play through this game without investing a lot of build time or money time into building a really cool elaborate terrain set piece for, frankly, an adventure that might take you 45 minutes to play through. Now I get into that, and then I also will fudge the terrain like a little. Like I just kind of was like, this is supposed to be a hill, and I'll just say, well, this part is a hill, and then I'll make the rules for that little strip of land with these surrounded rock pieces. Like, you can do stuff super easy. If it's like, hey, you have to go to this house and kill this giant spider in front of the house, it doesn't have to be a house. It could just be like some walls that are down, you know what I mean? And you say, oh, well, I can't go in through the walls because of whatever. Like, it's very easy and flexible. It's not going to affect the balance of the game or anything like that. And the other thing that's interesting is that there's enough, it has this really cool mechanic. This is what I'm going to leave you with. it's got your typical D&D stuff, lots of different stats. You're rolling D20s, you're interacting that way, your combat works that way. But there's also like choices. So there's a splash of like choose your own adventure. But again, you don't reset. I mean, if you're party wipes, I guess you'd reset. But it's hard to like, completely wipe. But it has this other mechanic where you have you take a normal deck of 52 cards, and there's like an event phase, and you flip those up, and then it'll tell you like add all the spades, ace through king, and that's your deck, and then add in like 3 red cards, right? So you shuffle those up, and then you flip the thing, and you just look at the table on the scenario, and it'll say like, oh, some bats come out of this little spawning point, or this NPC runs across the field if you draw the red card or something. So you can replay that scenario, and it's going to change things up, and it's kind of like a DM, acting in response and starting throwing random stuff at you. And there's just a lot of cool, neat things. And to me, if you get into the solo side of it, and again, you kind of sit with it. And this is kind of why I have the snow showing. I don't usually show the window on my videos, but that's kind of the solo part of this is like you're hunkered into your little cave or whatever, your room and your apartment, and you have this concept of hygge, which is a Danish thing, and also a Finnish thing. But anyway, so you get kind of in that warm, where you're comfortable with yourself, and you're able to like build this world. And that's where this one kind of comes into it for me, is like it's solo in terms of like I can craft the terrain pieces, I can paint the miniatures, I can kind of build up my party, it's like I set up my own little movie, and I can kind of play through that stuff, and then kind of see how it goes. And again, I think this would be really fun co-op. It does some scaling for that, and there's a new edition of the rule book as well, that if you do have the old edition, you can get a free PDF. There's like a couple of pages of like updates to kind of better balance the scaling from what I gather for playing co-op, which I would totally do with this. But yeah, this is just the completely like all-encompassing for me, the building, the crafting, the creating the characters in the party and playing through the adventures. Again, leaving it set up. I've just had this game, this has been a couple of months, but last time I played, I had it set up here for a couple of weeks. And I just had it set up, and I would just come back and play through the scenario and I go to the next one, because I kind of read ahead and see like, oh, what am I going to need here? So, okay, I'll set these pieces aside. And then as you sort of adventure in, it's this great visual experience. But again, you don't need to like go whole hog into that. And I don't think it's required to enjoy the game. You could get one of those grids and just kind of, draw stuff out and, have a little bit of terrain, some of that scatter terrain, that kind of thing. And then a couple of miniatures. Like if you got Descent, a copy of Descent at home, then just buy this. It's like $15. Well, how much is it? I don't know. The $15-$20 depends. They go on sale. I don't know. You get them at DriveThruRPG. You can just buy the PDF, for cheaper and throw it on your iPad. And then it'll just give you an adventure. Like that's it. I mean, you could use Descent tiles. I always say this when I talk about Frostgrave. If you get the one, the Perilous Dark, not the Perilous Dark. What's it? Hang on a minute. Into the Breeding Pits, Frostgrave, which is meant to be kind of a more tunnely Frostgrave. You could get that kind of stuff here. Just kind of adjust your scenario a little bit, and then play with your copy of Descent or Shadows of Brimstone even, and have some fantasy miniatures, and there you go. Like it's going to be a very rich, rewarding experience. All right, so that's number 1, Rangers Shadow Deep, 100%. Recommend that. So there's my top 10 solo games, and again, just with all the caveats, I'm very interested actually if you have any cool solo games, given my proclivities, or maybe in spite of my proclivities to not really like competitive, solo games or choose your adventure solo games. Maybe throw a couple at me, because it's always nice to have another solo experience to kind of dive through. Okay, thank you. Happy winter.